Imagine you are driving through this tiny, isolated town, right? And you come across a solemn stone monument.
Hmm.
And it's dedicated to one of the most horrific massacres in Western pioneer history. 300 people dead.
Wow. That's incredibly dark.
Right. But now, imagine finding out that this massacre never actually happened. Like it was completely fabricated.
Just entirely made up.
Entirely. Yet, the town fought tooth and nail to keep that monument standing.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. And then imagine hiking up to this towering rock formation in that same area, only to realize the granite at the very top is 30 million years old, but the stone sitting directly underneath it is 2.5 billion years old.
Right, which sounds like an absolute geological impossibility.
Exactly. You might find yourself wondering how either of those things makes any logical sense at all.
Well, it really does sound like fiction, but both of those things are very real. And they happen to exist in the exact same quiet, rugged corner of southern Idaho.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are looking at this striking landscape of sagebrush and dirt near the tiny communities of Almo and Malta.
Yeah, specifically the City of Rocks National Reserve and the neighboring Castle Rocks State Park.
Right. And when you zoom in on the sources covering this area, you realize this isn't just some scenic detour.
Not at all.
You are looking at a geographical palimpsest, like a place where 2.5 billion years of deep geological time, ancient indigenous harvesting, massive pioneer migrations, and even complex modern conservation battles are all written directly on top of each other.
It is a massive crossroads.
Okay, let's unpack this, because our mission today is to figure out the underlying mechanisms of this place. We want to know how extreme geography doesn't just shape history, but actually drives human psychology.
Yeah.
You know, like shaping what we believe and what we value.
Absolutely. And to understand the human behavior here, we really have to start with the literal foundation, the towering stone spires themselves. Yeah, the rocks. Because without the bizarre mechanics of how these specific rocks formed and decayed, absolutely none of the human history, not the Native American traditions, not the wagon trains, not the modern rock climbers, none of it would exist.
And the geology is genuinely mind-bending. I mean, you stand at the base of these stone pinnacles, and some of them are like 60 to 70 stories high.
Which is why early travelers thought they looked like a silent city.
Right. But you are actually looking at a physical collision of timelines. So most of these spires are made of something called the Almo Pluton.
Right, the younger granite.
Yeah, it's this light-colored sort of salt and pepper-looking granite that formed when a huge body of magma cooled deep underground roughly 26 to 30 million years ago, which, geologically speaking, is relatively young, right?
Oh, it's practically a newborn in rock years.
Great.
But 30 million years ago, this highly pressurized, younger magma forced its way up into the cracks and fissures of a much, much older body of rock. And that older rock is known as the Green Creek Complex.
And the Green Creek Complex is a staggering 2.5 billion years old.
Yeah, with a B.
With a B. I mean, it contains some of the oldest rocks found anywhere in the continental United States.
It really does.
So you have this wild visual where the younger rock is sitting right alongside or even completely on top of the ancient rock. And the best place to see this, according to the sources, is a formation called the Twin Sisters.
Oh, yeah, that's a perfect example.
It's these two massive pinnacles. The southern one is 2.5 billion years old, and the northern one is 30 million years old. I read that, and I just couldn't picture how that functionally happens. It sounds like a bizarre architectural mashup, like building a modern glass skyscraper directly on top of an ancient Egyptian pyramid.
That is a great way to visualize it. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it's all about intrusion followed by erosion.
Okay.
Think of the ancient 2.5 billion year old Green Creek Complex, like a massive, solid block of wood.
Right.
30 million years ago, intense pressure injected hot liquid glue, which is the younger magma, deep into the cracks of that wood. Over millions of years, the whole region was uplifted by tectonic forces.
Pushed up to the surface.
Exactly. Then, weather acted like sandpaper. It scrubbed away the top layers of the earth until both the ancient wood and the younger glue were exposed side by side on the surface.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. And the composition of that glue, that 30 million year old Almo Pluton granite, that is incredibly important, right?
Crucially important.
Because it's made of equal-sized crystals of feldspar, quartz, and mica.
Yes, and the mineral composition is the key to literally everything that follows. Those three minerals decay at totally different
Right,
rates.
because quartz is incredibly hard.
Exactly. Quartz resists weathering. But feldspar breaks down really quickly into clay, and mica, well, it just flakes off in
Oh, I
sheets.
see.
So as water seeps into the rock, freezes, and expands a mechanical process called frost wedging, it chips away the softer materials while leaving the hard quartz behind. The rock also peels away in layers like an onion, which is called exfoliation.
So instead of weathering into these smooth, featureless domes like you see in some places, the rock turns into this heavily textured, pockmarked surface.
Right, it's full of caves, divots, and knobs.
And that rough texture is exactly what trapped wind-blown soil and caught rainwater, right? Creating highly specialized microhabitats in an otherwise totally dry, harsh environment.
Exactly. And we can trace the human timeline straight back to those specific microhabitats.
Wow.
As the last ice age ended, the region was dominated by giant pluvial lakes. Pluvial just means rain-related.
Right, like ancient Lake Bonneville.
Yes. Constant heavy rains filled up these massive inland seas. But as the climate warmed and those lakes dried up, early human hunters had to follow megafauna like mammoths right up into the higher, wetter elevations near these rocks.
And as it got even drier over thousands of years, the Shoshone and Bannock peoples adapted perfectly to the environment those rocks sustained.
They did.
I mean, the City of Rocks area is actually the northernmost extension of the single-leaf pinyon pine tree. It shouldn't really grow there.
No, it's way too far north.
But those specific rock formations captured just enough moisture and blocked just enough wind to let these trees thrive.
And for the Shoshone bands, specifically those known as the rabbit eaters and the pine nut eaters and the Bannock people, this geological anomaly provided an absolute lifeline.
A completely reliable food source.
Exactly. Every fall, they traveled to this exact spot to harvest pine nuts. It was a nutrient-dense, easily storable food source that sustained them through brutal winters.
So the unique decay of the granite literally built the foundation for a thriving indigenous culture.
It really did.
But then the 1840s hit, and the purpose of the landscape shifts dramatically.
A total paradigm shift.
Right. The rocks go from being this biological haven for pine nuts to serving as a colossal geographical billboard.
Yes, because when the Great Overland Migration began, thousands of people were crossing what they perceived as a vast, punishing sagebrush sea.
They were terrified of getting lost.
Exactly. And because these spires were so tall and unique, they became an essential navigational beacon on the California Trail. If you saw what they called Steeple Rocks or Pyramid Circle, you knew you hadn't wandered off the map.
James Wilkins, a traveler in 1849, wrote in his diary about the area. He said, "They are in a romantic valley clustered together, which gives them the appearance of a city."
It's such a striking image.
It is. And 1849 is critical here, not just because of the gold rush, but because of the sheer desperation it created. Like, time was literally money. Which brings us to a guy named Benoni Morgan Hudspeth.
Oh, Hudspeth. He was co-captaining a massive wagon train, and he made a decision that fundamentally changed the map of the West.
Because the established route was so long.
Very long. The relatively safe route at the time went far north, up to Fort Hall on the Snake River, and then dropped back down. It was a massive detour.
So Hudspeth essentially looked at the rugged mountainous terrain pointing directly west from Soda Springs and said, "We're going straight through."
Just a straight line.
Yeah. He gambled that moving perpendicular across 6 different mountain ranges and intervening valleys, which is a physically agonizing route, would still shave crucial days off the trip to the goldfields compared to the Fort Hall detour.
It was an audacious risk. But he carved that route, merging back with the main trail at Cassia Creek near modern-day Malta in just 6 days.
6 days. Wow.
Yeah, his geographical gamble paid off so well that Hudspeth's cutoff became the dominant route for California-bound immigrants for a whole decade.
So you have thousands of wagons pouring through this natural choke point.
Yeah.
And when they rested at places like Circle Creek, they used the axle grease from their wagons to paint their names and the dates on the stone faces.
On formations we now call Register Rock and Camp Rock.
Right. Now, I have to push back on the romanticism here for a second.
Okay.
Because if you went to a national park today and painted your name in black grease on a rock, it would be a federal crime.
Oh, absolutely. You'd be arrested.
Right. So was this essentially just 19th century vandalism, or was it more like an analog social media check-in?
Well, what's fascinating here is the psychological necessity behind those signatures.
Psychological necessity.
Yeah. You have to remember, you are months into a journey where cholera, accidents, and starvation are actively killing the people around you.
Right.
The landscape is totally indifferent to your suffering. So those axle grease names were a vital communication network. They were literal proof of life left for family members in wagon trains that might be weeks behind them.
Wow, okay. That changes the context entirely.
Exactly. Psychologically, it was a defiant mark against a landscape trying to kill them. It was a message that said, I survived the crossing of the Great Desert.
It's the ultimate statement of, I was here. I mean, it really makes you look at those black smears on the rock with a lot more reverence.
It does.
But while the emigrants were desperate to pass through, another wave of people looked at this severe landscape and decided to try and conquer it. Which brings us to the hubris of the post-trail settlement era.
Oh, the attempt to tame this land is a masterclass in the mechanisms of boom and bust.
Yeah.
Let's look at the cattle industry. In 1869, a cattle dealer named James Q. Shirley brought 13,000 head of Texas Longhorns into the Almo area.
13,000.
Oh.
That is an unbelievable amount of livestock for a dry, high-desert ecosystem.
It was an ecological disaster waiting to happen. The massive herds systematically destroyed the native, deep-rooted grasses.
And without those grasses to hold moisture.
Exactly. Without them to insulate the soil, the ecosystem collapsed. And then came the catastrophic winters of 1882, 1886, and 1889.
Just back-to-back devastation.
Because the land was overgrazed, the cattle had absolutely no forage when the snows hit. The historical records show the old-time cowmen losing 50 to 90% of their herds.
30%.
Yeah. The Wine Cup brand went from branding 38,000 calves in 1885 to branding exactly 68 calves in 1891.
From 38,000 to 68.
Yeah.
The environment violently course-corrected. But despite that economic annihilation, agricultural settlers still tried to force the land to yield.
They just kept trying.
Mormon families began settling the Raft River Valley. By 1920, the town of Almo grew to 260 people, and they relied heavily on something called dryland farming.
Right.
For anyone unfamiliar, dryland farming means you were trying to grow crops, like wheat, in an arid climate entirely without irrigation. You rely strictly on rainfall and specific tilling methods to trap moisture in the soil.
Which is a massive gamble against the weather. And in this rocky, dry soil, the house usually won.
Right.
The division of labor required to survive these continuous failures was just brutal. Women were weaving, making soap, butchering meat, acting as midwives.
And the men took on intense physical labor just to supplement their failing farms. You see the toll this took in historical records of individuals like this homesteader from Malta named Fred Gardner.
Oh, Fred's story is incredible.
It is. Fred had to quit school at age 9 to tend sheep. He worked as a logger and a heavy construction laborer on the Oakley Dam. And the stories of his physical strength are legendary.
Oh, yeah.
Like he could hold 2 50-pound bags of wheat straight out on either side of his body. There's even a story of him physically throwing a loudmouth out of a bar.
But the physical strength is only half the story, right?
Exactly.
Because the same man who threw someone across a room would be found in the middle of a workday, having left his plow standing in the field, sitting inside his farmhouse, beautifully playing the violin.
It highlights such a deep psychological truth. When your entire existence is defined by brutal, back-breaking labor against an unforgiving landscape, you desperately need to cultivate beauty.
You have to, or you break.
Right. But here's where it gets really interesting, because sometimes playing the violin isn't enough to cope with the hardship. Sometimes a community needs a grand myth to justify their suffering.
Enter the Almo Massacre.
Yes.
This is perhaps the most revealing moment in the region's history, precisely because it isn't history at all.
So, if you visit Almo today, there is a monument erected in 1938 by the Daughters of Idaho Pioneers. The inscription claims that in 1861, a horrible massacre took place where 300 westbound immigrants were killed by Native Americans and only 5 escaped.
Which, if true, would be one of the largest, most horrific massacres in the history of the Western migration.
Right.
But esteemed historians, including Brigham Matson and Merle Wells, they thoroughly investigated this. They audited newspaper archives, War Department records, Indian Service documents, every conceivable contemporary source.
And what did they find?
They found absolutely nothing.
The event is entirely fake.
Yeah.
The first time anyone ever even mentioned this supposedly massive event was in a 1936 book called 6 Decades Back.
Yes.
And it was written by a man who based it on the dubious childhood memories of a guy who lived hundreds of miles away in Utah.
Exactly.
Yet, when historians proposed taking the monument down in the 1990s, the residents of Almo were furious. They actively fought to keep a monument to a fake tragedy that unfairly demonizes local indigenous tribes, claiming it was part of their cultural fabric. So I have to ask, why would you fight for a fake tragedy?
Well, it reveals the mechanism of myth-making in isolated cultures.
Okay.
When generations of families have faced continuous grinding hardship, like losing your entire livelihood to a single winter, or breaking your back on a dryland farm that produces nothing as psychological deficit forms.
You feel like it was all for nothing.
Exactly. So a grand historical tragedy validates the suffering of those settlers. It elevates their struggle from a mundane narrative of we tried to farm bad soil and failed to an epic narrative of we tamed a landscape forged in blood and horror.
Wow. They needed the myth to justify the struggle. That is incredibly profound.
It really is.
Ultimately, though, the struggle to tame the land largely failed. I mean, of the 19 land patents filed for dryland farms in what is now the City of Rocks between 1910 and 1919, almost all were completely abandoned by the 1920s.
The environment won.
It did.
Mm-hmm.
But that agricultural failure is the exact mechanism that saved the landscape.
Yeah.
Because the land couldn't be heavily developed for commercial farming or industry, it just sat relatively untouched.
Right.
The historic wagon ruts, the axle grease signatures, the ancient shonen pictographs, they all survived because large-scale modern development simply couldn't take root in that soil.
So what does this all mean for the modern era? I look at this landscape and see it as finding its true purpose late in life. It failed as a barrier to stop the pioneers. It failed as a cattle empire. It failed as an agricultural hub. But in the 1960s, rock climbers from Utah arrived.
Yeah, they touched those rough feldspar and quartz granite spires, realized the friction was perfect, and transformed the area into a world-class outdoor jungle gym.
Today, there are over 300 technical climbing routes with amazing, adventurous names like Bloody Fingers and No Cash Refunds.
Which is fantastic, but that explosion of recreation completely flipped the script.
How so?
Well, the land wasn't an obstacle anymore, it was a destination. Suddenly, the 2.5-billion-year-old rocks were seeing unprecedented wear and tear from thousands of tourists.
Divorced a totally new kind of complex management. In 1988, Congress stepped in and designated the 14,300-acre City of Rocks National Reserve.
Right.
And the conservation effort expanded in the year 2000 with the Castle Rock Ranch Acquisition Act. That allowed for the purchase of private ranch land to create the neighboring Castle Rock State Park.
And what makes this area so distinct today is how it's run. It's a rare cooperative effort where the National Park Service and the Idaho Department of Parks and Recreation jointly manage the land.
Which is really unique.
It is, and this raises an important question, one that defines the modern era of public lands. How do you balance all of these overlapping claims?
Right, because everyone wants something different from the park.
Exactly. You have to zone the park so modern climbers can access roads without destroying the ancient Shoshone pictographs with their climbing chalk.
Right.
You have to close certain rocks entirely to protect nesting raptors, like Virginia's warbler. You have tourists who want pristine views of the California trail wagon ruts, and you have ranchers who still hold grazing rights on the surrounding lands.
It is a constant, delicate negotiation to let people experience the area without loving it to death.
It really is.
So, to summarize the incredible mechanics of history we've unpacked today in this one quiet corner of southern Idaho, we started with the violent geological intrusion of younger magma into ancient continental crust.
The literal foundation.
Right. And the unequal weathering of those minerals created a microclimate for pinyon pines, which physically sustained the Shoshone and Bannock peoples.
Mm-hmm.
That same striking geology later provided a crucial navigational beacon for gold rushers gambling on Hudspeth's Cutoff, who left axle grease messages just to prove they existed.
Yeah.
Then came the hubris of the pioneer settlers, where devastating winters and failed dryland farming pushed a community to erect a monument to a fake massacre just to cope with their isolation.
A fascinating psychological defense.
Truly. And finally, the modern era, where the failure of agriculture preserved the land just enough for climbers and conservationists to protect it.
When you lay it all out like that, it leaves us with something really critical to think about.
What's that?
When you stand in the City of Rocks and look up at a towering stone spire, what is actually there? I mean, a geologist sees the mechanisms of frost wedging. A Shoshone descendant sees an ancient, vital harvest ground.
Right.
A desperate 1849 emigrant saw a milestone. A pioneer saw an enemy that needed taming. And a modern climber sees a playground.
The landscape itself, the quartz, the dirt, the sagebrush, it hasn't changed. But human beings treat the landscape like a mirror. We project whatever our current generation desperately needs onto those rocks.
Exactly. Which leaves us with this final thought to mull over. What will the next generation project onto the City of Rocks? As our climate changes and our relationship with recreation evolves decades from now, when people look at those ancient spires, what will they need them to be?
That is a phenomenal question. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. The next time you drive past a quiet, seemingly empty patch of rugged land near your own home, pull over and take a closer look. Because as we've seen today, the emptiest stages usually hold the most densely packed stories. Until next time.